Okay, so welcome everybody to our
Are-
latest event as part of our 1980s International Research Network. My name is Jim Cooper, and I'm delighted today to introduce you all to Professor Derek Katzum. Before I introduce Derek, just to cover housekeeping issues, if you see the captions on your screen, you can remove them. They're there for accessibility reasons. Likewise, if you've got any questions to ask Derek or even some comments to add to the discussion, please do put them in the chat. So Derek will be talking, and then there'll be plenty of time then for questions. So by way of introduction then for our fantastic speaker, Professor Katzum, he's Professor of History and also the Kathleen Cosper Dunnigan Professor in the Humanities at the University of Texas Permian Basin. And he's also a Senior Research Associate at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, where Derek spent 2016 as a Hugh LeMay Fellow in the Humanities. Derek is the author of Flashpoint, How Little Known Sporting Event Fueled America's Anti-Apartheid Movement, which came out in 2021. He's also the author of Freedom's Mainline, which is the journey of reconciliation and the freedom rides from 2009. Also has written Beyond the Pitch, which is the spirit, culture, and the politics of Brazil's 2014 World Cup, and Bleeding Red, a Red Sox fan's diary of the 2004 season. And Derek's next book will be Don't Stick to Sports, The American Athlete's Fight Against Injustice, and that'll be published later this year by Rowman and Littlefield. So I think without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Derek Katzum, our next speaker for our Back to the Future seminar series, who will be talking about Pleased to Meet Me, thinking about the 1980s, a personal and professional journey. So Derek, over to you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be part of it. James, thank you for initiating this project. I think it's a lot of fun, and I want to thank everybody involved for staging this seminar series, and I'm excited to see what emerges out of it. I also am going to say I'm not going to have any visuals. I'm not going to share my screen or anything like that, because one, I'm not good at that kind of thing, and two, I find it oftentimes distracting, but mostly I'm not good at it. So I'm sorry I don't look more like 80s Tom Cruise, but them's the breaks. I'm a child of the 80s. I turned 9 years old in 1980. I turned 18 years old in 1989. I have foggy, half-formed memories of the back half of the 1970s, but I remember the 1980s, and like anyone my age, I think I remember them well. Though as a historian, I know better than to actually think that. Politically, I vaguely remember Reagan's election in 1980. I would never be old enough to vote against him, only casting my first presidential vote against his vice president, George H.W. Bush, in 1992. I remember clearly the Red Sox breaking my heart in 1986, the lowest point of the most complex relationship of my life with the Red Sox. And I remember the great Celtics teams in the 1980s, led by Larry Legend, Larry Joe Bird, the hick from French Lick, sorry. I entered the 1980s loving ABBA. I left the 1980s listening to Public Enemy before falling in love with the decade's greatest band, The Replacements, the self-sabotaging Minneapolis post-punk band I would only truly come to in college in the early 1990s. This was the tail end of the era when cable television was still a luxury, unavailable, for example, on the rural dirt road where I lived, and when most Americans still watched 3 networks and had a common pop culture language. We watched the finale of MASH. We all owned Thriller, even if you were a rock fan. Rocky defeated Ivan Drago, thus winning the Cold War. Arnold proved that woodenness was no impediment to a blockbuster acting career. And in case anyone was wondering, Mookie indeed did the right thing. Madonna revealed our still ongoing hypocrisies about sex, and we wanted to be like Mike. I became a liberal in the 1980s and thought Alex P. Keaton was a weenie, and did not interrogate quite enough the idea that Marty McFly kind of claimed credit for inventing rock and roll, never mind the whole subtext with his mother. My 1980s were, I must admit, very white and very straight. I was homophobic in high school. There's not much question about that, at least up until the tail end of the decade. And this is all a particular irony given my work today on race and politics. I entered college at decade's end, where I would become a history and political science double major. Like I said, I'm a child in the 1980s for good or for ill. But I'm also a historian, sometimes of the 1980s. My work is on race, politics, and sports in the United States and South Africa. I've written a book about a bizarre 1981 Springbok tour to the United States, and have long been working intermittently on a project on South Africa in the 1980s. My latest book out in October looks at American sports and politics from 1918 to the present, including, of course, the 1980s. I'm finalizing a special issue of a journal on campus apartheid movements that is overwhelmingly 80s focused. More on this in a few minutes. It'll provide kind of the substantive focus of this talk. And I added a course in the 1980s to my teaching repertoire in 2022. In other words, it sometimes feels like I've made a career in no small part out of my coming of age years. One of my favorite lines from one of my favorite historians, C. Vann Woodward, is the twilight zone that lies between living memory and written history is one of the favorite breeding places of mythology. I need to keep this in mind every time I think that my having lived through the 1980s gives me some special insight. What it certainly did is shape my outlook, my ideology, my prejudices, and my pieties. In a sense, I'm actually probably better equipped to look at South Africa in the 1980s than the US because I've developed a distance from those events. Maybe always had a distance from those events, even living and working there for more than 25 years. Despite Tom Rathers and Tom Brokaw's intoning about apartheid over images of a township uprising and security force brutality, which appeared on the nightly news on weeknights before syndicated reruns of MASH and the greatest but most complex, or perhaps complicated show in the 1970s, All in the Family, whose themes were still very much germane to the 1980s. South Africa was on our TV screens every night, particularly by the second half of the 1980s. And again, I'll talk more about this momentarily. The 80s will go down as the last decade in which print and video sources provided the vast, indeed the overwhelming majority of historical documentation. By the end of the 1990s, email, which I first sent as a master's student at UNC Charlotte in 1994, was ubiquitous. And despite the myth that the internet lasts forever, in fact, a massive percentage of that first generation of websites lies dormant, lies dead, or has completely disappeared. I presciently printed a lot of the internet in the 1990s for later use, and I'm lucky to have done so. One wonders what historians of the 21st century will do, what sources they will use. Presidents still produce documents, though sometimes they steal them. But the 1980s will go down as the last decade of completely traditional historical sources. My students are flabbergasted by the very idea of cursive handwriting, for example. People were still using cursive handwriting in December 1989, when even my dorkiest friends were not using emails or this thing called the internet. Meanwhile, I have students who legitimately may have never read a physical copy of a newspaper. To most of our students today, the Reader's Guide to Periodicals may as well be chiseled in stone and written in hieroglyphics. So there are going to be sourcing questions about the more current age that I think the 1980s are the sort of last decade of this kind of traditional sourcing. But the 1980s have also properly become history. When I first taught a university class in the 1990s, I felt comfortable not taking the second half of the US history survey much beyond 1980. It allowed me to avoid Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, people I was happy to avoid, but also people who would reveal my own ideological biases in a way that even Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter, from whom I had at least some critical distance, did not. I now take this approach with Barack Obama to a degree and Donald Trump completely, a luxury I will not have in a decade or so. During my first year in South Africa in 1997, I was working on South Africa's 1980s. And at a talk I gave, someone in the audience, an old or older, he was probably younger than I am now, white man said, "But you're not really doing history, are you? This is all current events." I chafed then. My PhD advisor at Ohio University's Contemporary History Institute always said, you can think historically about events from yesterday, and you can be very ahistorical about events from a century ago. But there was at least the root of a point. These events I was reconstructing were events that occurred not only within that person's recent lifetime, they happened more recently relative to 1997 than the release of Carly Rae Jepsen's Call Me Maybe is to today. Indeed, Carly, this is crazy. Of course, now, in my early 50s, 11 years does not seem much time at all. When I arrived in South Africa that first time, I was 25, soon to turn 26, and 11 or 12 years was a substantial portion of my life. From that vantage point, a dozen years earlier, I did not have a driver's license, had never had a real girlfriend, and was still playing Babe Ruth baseball, just a little removed from Little League, had never even heard of Williams College, where I would enroll a fall of 1989. Today, I might well look skeptically at someone claiming to be doing history graduate work on, say, Obama's second election, the London Olympics, or the cultural impact of Carly Rae Jepsen. I could imagine myself saying something along the lines of, but you're not really doing history, are you? This is all current events. Email me, maybe. Speaking of which, it's remarkable how I'm a historian who seems to have no idea how time actually works. My mind is blown by such simple, factual, and arithmetical realities that the release of Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction was closer to the Truman administration than it is to today, or that Thriller came out closer to Jackie Robinson's debut than to the Black Lives Matter protests. Oh, and Skynet, the despot robot overlord corporation from a dystopian future, sends its killing machine, the cybernetic android assassin known as the Terminator, back from 2029, nearer to today than the election of Donald Trump is. Sadly, the dystopian future is less of a surprise than it ought to be, given our dystopian present, by which I mean Donald Trump. But given ChatGPT's sudden ascension, I might especially be aware of robots that look remarkably lifelike, a description that also fits Arnold Schwarzenegger. On a concrete level, here's one example of the personal and the historical merging. I've just finished editing a special issue of Sifundi, the Journal of South African and American Studies, on the issue of college and university campus anti-apartheid. What follows is drawn from my introduction to that issue, which may or may not become an edited book project. As I mentioned, my first awareness of the issue of apartheid came when I was in my tweens and early teens growing up in Newport, New Hampshire. It came from two sources roughly at the same time. The first source was the nightly news. In an era when almost everyone in the country watched half an hour of local news, followed by half an hour from one of the national networks, the second hour was, by the end of 1984, saturated with coverage from South Africa. And I suspect, if anything, that was even more so in the UK and in parts of the world that were, truth be told, much closer tied into the anti-apartheid movement than the US. Uprisings in the townships and police brutality were followed by footage of a speech from a prominent figure, usually either Reverend Desmond Tutu, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, or Winnie Mandela, if she was not in internal or house arrest, the struggle heroine and wife of the imprisoned Nelson Mandela. But at the same time, Dartmouth College, about 45 minutes and 1,000,000 miles away from working class Newport, was experiencing vibrant and contested anti-apartheid politics and protests. These are mediated to me through either the NBC television affiliate located in Hanover, which must be one of the smallest local affiliates of a major network in the country, or else via a little boombox radio cassette player, the most 80s of teen essentials, that, if placed just so, could pick up snippets from the Dartmouth College radio station, and thus the story unfolding on the Dartmouth Green and across campus. The snippets that I gathered made college seem like a den of intrigue and protest and political maneuvering. Anti-apartheid activists had built shanties on the Dartmouth Green, the big giant green that sort of provides a central focal point for both Hanover, New Hampshire, and for Dartmouth College, both to express solidarity with the victims of apartheid, but also to draw attention to the campaign to divest Dartmouth's holdings from South Africa. These motives were similar to the student and faculty and staff campaigns on dozens of elite college campuses across the country. What seemed to give Dartmouth's story a unique resonance is that the critics of the anti-apartheid campaign, the anti-apartheid forces, as it were far more aggressive than at many other places, as I would only discover subsequently when examining campus anti-apartheid movements more broadly. Dartmouth hosted the Dartmouth Review, a right-wing publication supported by the National Review, William Buckley's magazine that embodied the new conservatism that had culminated in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Just as Buckley's magazine had been hostile to both the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement. And let me stop here. When we talk about National Review, always keep in mind that you name a civil rights campaign in the 1950s and 1960s. By the time the National Review emerged, the National Review opposed it. National Review were deeply critical of the Freedom Rides, were deeply critical of Freedom Summer, were deeply critical of virtually everything going on in civil rights. Keep that in mind whenever you're dealing with sort of the rise of modern American conservatism and the role of the National Review. And they certainly were opposed to the anti-apartheid movement, possibly even more so than, possibly even friendlier to Pretoria than they had been to Jackson, Montgomery, and elsewhere. And it was overly sympathetic to Pretoria, just as it had been sympathetic to the segregationists in the State House. The Dartmouth Review engaged in sophomoric political critiques that pushed the envelope of anti-Semitism and racism. It was deeply anti-Semitism to the then president of Dartmouth, who was Jewish, man named Friedman, and some of the caricatures of the president were evocative of deeply anti-Semitic tropes. It was ardently hostile to the shanties on the green, to the concept of divestment. And when some group or groups vandalized and knocked down the shanties, it was long suspected that the review had played a role. Certainly conservatives had a right to their voice, and there was room to critique aspects of the divestment campaigns. But Dartmouth's right wing embodied more than critique. It embodied a pro-apartheid backlash. We can possibly note that Dinesh D'Souza cut his teeth in the Dartmouth Review in the 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, and thus by the time I got to Williams College in 1989, events had seemingly obviated the need for an active anti-apartheid struggle on all but the most activist campuses. Most universities and colleges, and virtually all elite private ones, had divested from apartheid years earlier, and it was a given that apartheid and engagement with it was loathsome. In 1986, Congress had passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which Ronald Reagan had, with the National Review as one of his main cheerleaders, vetoed, and which Congress overrode in spectacular fashion. Meanwhile, in South Africa, even as security police violence continued to dominate, changes were afoot that would result in Nelson Mandela's release from prison and the unbanning of the African National Congress, the ANC, and other organizations. Williams's anti-apartheid campaigns have been similar to many at comparable schools. By the early to mid-1970s, a wide range of student groups, including African and African-American student leadership, worked with faculty to call for the college to divest any South Africa-connected holdings. By the 1980s, these calls had accelerated. As at Dartmouth, students built a shantytown in the college's largest green, known then as Baxter Lawn. A small group of students who were members of the Williams Anti-Apartheid Coalition, the WAAC, engaged in a hunger strike in early 1983 to draw attention to the divestiture issue, an undoubtedly earnest but largely performative gesture. In 1986, WAAC activists placed 160 crosses on the Baxter Lawn to commemorate those who have fallen in the last 3.5 years in the struggle for freedom in South Africa. They punctuated their statement with, "The struggle continues." The anti-apartheid campaign, and as with Dartmouth, though on a much smaller scale, the response of its opponents, occupied space in a number of Williams student publications in the early and mid-1980s. Fast forward to 1997, when I was researching in a branch of the South African National Archives in Port Elizabeth, working on research for another project. I came across a document that listed which colleges and universities in the United States had divested and when. I found it fascinating, but it didn't tie to any particular work that I was doing at the time. So after noting that certain schools divested in the 1970s and that the bulk did so in the 1980s, I moved on. Those early schools, it turned out, were outliers, ahead of the curve, but also required not only an engaged student body, faculty and staff, but also receptive administrators, usually a mealy-mouthed lot in the best of times, and ultimately the approval of regents or trustees or boards of governors, not a group notoriously known for their leftist politics. It turns out that the document came from the American Committee on Africa, which regularly put out an updated summary of successful university divestments, and which I'd subsequently seen versions of numerous times in archives. An April 1981 report showed that the first 7 schools to sell off all of their stocks in banks and corporations doing business in South Africa were the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and Ohio University in 1977. Michigan State University, the University of Washington, and Antioch College in 1978, Hampshire College in 1979, and Indiana Central University in 1980. An 8th school, the University of Oregon, had moved to divest, though that decision was pending a court decision. So that's a shockingly small number with a fairly consistent approach, either large, major flagship state universities, a very left-wing small college in Antioch and then in Hampshire, and then the outlier, Indiana Central. Then after that, though, a dozen auxiliary organizations of the University of California College and University System had also divested by that date, and more than 24 colleges and universities, including Williams, in the form of $700,000 plus worth of deposits in 6 banks, had sold at least part of their South African portfolio. Dartmouth was not among this early wave of college and university divestment. The number of colleges and universities engaging in partial and whole divestment would rise as the years passed, exploding in the period from 1984 to 1987, when the anti-apartheid protests in South Africa and the government's response to them were at their heaviest. This was a time when the anti-apartheid forces in South Africa were working to make South Africa ungovernable, and in which the South African government engaged in a total strategy to confront what they called this total onslaught. Very obviously ominous terms. As my own work and career progressed, it seemed like no matter what project I was working on, I kept running into and making note of documents on campus anti-apartheid movements. In 2015, I was lucky enough to win a fellowship from Hoover Library at Stanford to work on a couple of projects connected to South Africa, where they have very good holdings. I finished that work with relative ease and found myself with time, and the collections I had been looking at had box after box, folder after folder on anti-apartheid movements at Stanford, the University of California at Berkeley, and well beyond. I took thousands of photos of these documents, and it became clear that the story was immense, necessary, but also yet to be told. A few years later, I received a Frederick B. Arts summer research grant to explore the archives at Oberlin College. Note my shameless name dropping, which I'll explain as giving credit to benefactors. After having spent some time in the Williams archives at a class reunion weekend, because I am just that cool, I applied for the arts grant specifically to look at the anti-apartheid movement at another small liberal arts college, but one with a more activist reputation than Williams, which, while liberal, has always been tainted with a hint of apathy, at least relative to more radical campuses like fellow little three-member Wesleyan, or like Oberlin, with its deep roots in student, faculty, and staff activist politics extending back to the abolitionist movement. Excuse me. Finally, in the process of conducting some research, I happened across a story from Oregon State University involving an anti-apartheid campaign that was centered around the university's wrestling team and Coca-Cola vending machines. One time I was able to get to the Pacific Northwest. I got to Corvallis, and Oregon State's lovely campus, to look into the protests against South Africa there, and to a degree at the University of Oregon as well. That will likely become an article or a chapter. Everywhere I turned, no matter the project in which I was immersed, campus anti-apartheid movement seemed to cross my transom. And believe it or not, this solipsistic narrative has a point. But looking closely at a handful of schools, Dartmouth, Williams, Oberlin, Oregon State, Stanford, Cal Berkeley, and more intermittently at dozens of others, especially through the collections at Stanford and the African Activist Archive at Michigan State, which is digitized and is incredible, I came to grasp fairly widespread similarities in some of the narratives as they played out, especially at elite private and major flagship public schools. There was a fairly universal pattern of how the debate played out. In the late 60s and early 70s, activists, usually either led by African and or African-American students, faculty, and staff, began talking about divesting university funds from South Africa. Occasionally, they received a respectful hearing, but most often little happened beyond that. Then, in the wake of the 1976 Soweto uprisings, these criticisms became more sustained. Campus anti-apartheid organizations emerged that proved enduring, with more students, faculty, and staff joining in. As the 1980s progressed, and South Africa increasingly became one of the central global stories, with brutality against the country's majority a nearly nightly reality on the network news, and especially with the explosive uprisings in the country from late 1984, campus protests against South Africa policy and university complicity in these policies accelerated. American college and university trustees, regents, and boards of governors reformed their investment portfolios. But within these institutions, the debate that played out also had taken on strikingly similar tones throughout the country. Supporters of divestment consistently argued from a platform of human rights and dignity and called for a simple emphasis on the rights of the country's Black majority and against the clear evil that was apartheid, including the country's colonial apartheid stranglehold over Southwest Africa, now Namibia. But opponents of divestment made what was a fairly universal argument themselves, that the chief responsibility of those overseeing the institution's investments was to maximize returns. Social issues or politics had no place in such decisions, and that, in any case, divestment would not do any good. By the middle of the decade, these arguments had increasingly lost favor, especially as other institutions, entire cities and towns, major corporations, banks, nonprofits, and the like withdrew South African holdings from their own portfolios. Cities and states passed their own version of divestment legislation, and all of this culminated in the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which Reagan vetoed, and again, Congress promptly overrode. But I also came to see that there were differences across campuses, unique stories that played out based on a host of factors: leadership from students, faculty, and staff, receptiveness from administrators and regents of boards of governors, boards of trustees, political climates, especially surrounding state universities, regional differences, histories of protests at various schools, the presence of African and especially South African students or campus personnel, and a host of other issues. I realized there was a project there, maybe multiple ones. With so many colleges and universities in the United States, depending on how you count colleges, how you count post-secondary trade schools, how you count community colleges, junior colleges, about 4,500 or so now, probably around 3,500 to 4,000 then. All of which would have had their own individual campus anti-apartheid experiences. I knew it was a story too big for me to tackle on my own. And then if there's anything more, a more vibrant story played out across the world, across Africa, and of course in South Africa. So I figured what better way to get this done than to have other people do it for me. And so the special issue came about that way. But in all honesty, it began as the result of my exposure to this issue in my living room and in my bedroom as a teenager in New Hampshire. Not all of my subsequent work has had quite the personal narrative attached to it, though I suspect that most historical work has a backstory to its author. And as I've gotten older, of course, the work becomes internalized. Nonetheless, I think recognizing that journey, recognizing that, as they said in another decade, that has drawn considerable attention from historians, and that once drew a lot of interest in students, this is less and less the case, I must note. The personal is political. And I'll add, the personal can be very historical. And it is worth noting that idea that there was a period, the 80s, 90s, maybe into the early 2000s, where courses on the 1960s were among the most popular in a history department's repertoire. And the 60s have lost that romance, lost a little bit of that flavor, and that maybe the 1980s are becoming one of those decades that draws more interest than others. Thank you for listening. I welcome questions, comments, or for those my age or thereabouts, your own stories on experiencing the 1980s feeding your work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Derek. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that, Derek. Thank you. I've made lots of notes, just prompted my own thinking. As a child of the 80s myself, although I was a kid playing Transformers a lot of the time in the 1980s. The first time I ran Transformers, of course. So I'll suggest to colleagues is that if you obviously can put your questions, if you like, in the chat, or if you prefer to talk, let me know and I will use my power as the host to allow you to talk. There's actually buttons that allow to talk, as horrible as that might sound. So if anybody would like to talk, then perhaps maybe raise your hand or say so in the chat, or put your question in the chat, whatever you prefer. Obviously, if you do talk though over the audio, you will be on the recording. So perhaps just keep that in mind if you have any concerns about that. But perhaps while we wait for colleagues to gather their thoughts, when you're talking about leaders, Derek, it got me thinking, this may not be as fully formed as your paper, but I often think about when we study our leaders, like presidents, prime minister, whatever, we need to be thinking about their background and how they grow up and what informs them. So I suppose for our purpose of the 1980s, Reagan, as obviously is a child of the interwar period, of the Great Depression, New Deal in Midwest America, son of an alcoholic father, more religious mother. That's kind of his background. So grows up in relatively poor in traveling a lot in Illinois, and of course Margaret Thatcher is a child of the Second World War. So, which of course why Thatcher always thinks nothing good ever comes from Europe, and why she doesn't think a unified Germany is a good idea. I was just thinking that you obviously got in the 80s, obviously it's from an Anglo-American perspective here, so perhaps other comparison we can make as well, but you have two leaders who were shaped by the 30s and the 40s, and therefore they're in charge at a time where, as you said so clearly, Derek, we've got students, people your age campaigned against apartheid and so on, calling on the universities to stop cutting ties with South Africa. We've also got people who are kind of campaigning against or campaigning for better support for people who are afflicted by HIV/AIDS and so on. So in some ways, is the 80s an example where you've got social movements emerging to social challenges, and they're led by people who don't understand the challenges. And so some actually Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and they're almost fighting over the New Deal still, but they're not fighting over America as it is in the 80s. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I think that Reagan, in many ways, embodying the rise of the new right, certainly plays a role in this. The National Review. I think that in some ways, this is a sort of backdrop in which, as much as I don't want to give outsized credit to that generation, I think the echo of the 60s is playing over it. I think this is maybe the last great playing out where it's not just pure cosplay of 60s protests, of people who, because thinking about the leaders is true, although to be fair, of course, those in Congress overriding the Anti-Apartheid Act would have their own narratives. But a lot of these students are going to be, I mean, look, if you're 18 in 1985, you were born in 1967, mom and dad might have stories. If you are leading the anti-apartheid movement in 1983, your parents were your age and a little older when the Montgomery bus boycott took place. So I think that backdrop does play a role to inform who these students were. I wouldn't be surprised if a good number of the students who were leaders in these campaigns weren't sort of products of parents, or perhaps providing a backlash in the sort of opposite way of how Alex P. Keaton marks a backlash to his hippie parents. I also think that there's a component in this of privilege. It isn't surprising that the schools, generally speaking, where this happened, which is why in the edited collection, I'm so glad to see contributions from what was then North Texas State, from what is Grand Valley today, from what was not then an elite state school, certainly is now. I was just there this weekend, the University of Florida, as from the SUNY campus, as well as from Yale. My introduction with those elite schools, and then some from South Africa and elsewhere, because I do think that part of the reason why the story becomes too big, for me to want to or be able to write a comprehensive history of anti-apartheid movements on campus is because there are all these stories at every campus, and I want people to be able to tell the strength of the issue, anyways, is the diversity of voices and where they come from, and telling stories that I'd never dug into, and how variegated this story really is.
Yeah, I think likewise, I think interesting how the impact that the 60s had, the memory of the 60s, or the children of the 60s, or the children of the 60s. It's likewise, if you look obviously then today, the social movements we have today and the leaders we have today, because they would have been shaped by the 80s. And so perhaps some of the things which you highlighted about, about inequality in terms of sexuality or in terms of diversity, that's very much at the forefront today in terms of social movements. Yeah. In terms of leadership as well. Also, perhaps in terms of responses to economic crisis, just like perhaps in the 30s, like in the 1960s, the Great Society can't go back to the poverty, the inequality of 30, 40 years ago. Nowadays, we can't. The idea of foreclosures on homes is what can we do to avoid that? Because it was so rife in the 1980s. The idea of trying to essentially bail out industries because of the collapse of industries and so on in the 1980s. So the memory of the bad things and also maybe some of the campaign for successes. Not talk about overriding the apartheid veto and so on.
Well, and think of it, I mean, that whole idea early on laying there, of how time kind of blows my mind, despite the fact that I'm a historian. I mean, if you are one of these students in 1982, 1983, you are closer in time to the Birmingham campaign, to Freedom Summer, to all these things than we are to 9/11. And think about the shadow that 9/11 casts over everything that we do. I mean, when on my book that I'm just doing on sports, this sort of hyper patriotism and the issue of kneeling and how controversial that is, that's all the result of post 9/11 politics. And we're dealing with it right now in sports all the time. So, I mean, imagine if you're a college student And it's not even this question of kneeling or whatever. It is, this has echoes of Freedom Summer, but then you're seeing the images. I mean, these college students are seeing the images of South Africa that I'm seeing every night, but they're also reading the New York Times. They're also connected in ways that, that I never could have been as a high school kid in a small town. And seeing these stories. I mean, this period from 1984 to 1987, this book I've been off and on thinking about doing is basically called The Long 1985. At the end of 1985, Alan Paton does a big long feature in one of South Africa's newspapers. I mean, it's like 2 full newspaper pages in the old broad page newspapers, like this wide. And it says, 1985, could it have been the unhappiest year of our lives? And I'm going to look at from the fall uprising in 1984 to through all of 1985, which is this chaotic year, and maybe to the beginning of 87, but really definitely 86. And I mean, far more intense than anything that ever happened in the United States, far more deadly, apartheid, far more rigid in a whole lot of ways, with the military enforcing it. I mean, it is draconian circumstance. And this is read at one point, someone doing work on this kind of thing. I mean, it was one of the 3 most covered international stories throughout the entire 1980s. I mean, and South Africa more specific than the other 2, which would have been the Cold War, sort of writ broadly. And since the Americans are involved in that, I'm talking about American media, naturally that's going to be huge. And then conflict in the Middle East. So this is at that level. And it's really remarkable if you think about the 1980s, that in the intransigence of various kinds of struggles, the question of Israel and Palestine, the question of Northern Ireland, and the question of apartheid in South Africa, the idea that from the vantage point of 1985, that the South African one would be resolved first, I think would have been stunning to a lot of people. But there was also that engagement on the American side, and on the obviously, echoing what was going on in the UK and Ireland and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is that the idea of how students remember these things and these developments? So, I forget that a lot of students, so I teach a born post 9/11, whereas a lecturer, college professor my age, back in the 1980s, would have remembered Eisenhower. It just gets me thinking. I remember years ago when I was on my first research trip to the United States in 2008, I think it was. It was during the Obama-Clinton primaries, and everyone I spoke to around America, they were all excited for Barack Obama, and they said to me, "Are you excited?" I said, "No." I said, "Why?" I said, "Well, we had Tony Blair," and these kind of people a bit younger than me were like, "What?" I said, "Well, Tony Blair, the guy, who, he was, that kind of transformative, exciting figure." So I often feel sorry for our students that perhaps they can't remember a figure like that now, like Obama and so on. So, yeah, obviously, colleagues, if you do want to join the conversation, please do say something, drop it in the chat, or let me know, and I'll allow you to talk. In terms of obviously the 80s now, obviously talk about the people in the 80s, how they're thinking about the past. But how did people in the 80s then think about the future? Because obviously you have things like, Star Trek is brought back. But obviously, how do, obviously you touched on film and music, a bit of Marty McFly, Back to the Future and so on. And I know Marty goes back and obviously goes forward, but what's the sense in the 80s of what they thought the future would be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we saw in the 70s, you saw that sort of romance of the 50s. And that continued a little bit, particularly in the minds of the Reagan types. Looking back, I mean, we've been doing it lately, right? I mean, the question about MAGA, the Make America Great Again, I always want to wonder when. And one of the things I clipped from this was a paragraph on how I think MAGA is kind of looking back to the 1980s. Is kind of, because that's Trump's. That's when America was great for Trump, right? The art of the deal and all that kind of stuff. The thoughts of the future are interesting, because I think in the 1980s, in a lot of ways, they had entered the future. the 80s were the future, right? It was I mean, obviously no idea of what was to come with technological explosion, but it felt like the day technology had exploded. I don't know if there's any decade where self-referentially people will say, to indicate that they were in a new modern age, this is the 80s. Watch sitcoms from the 80s, which I do with fair regularity. They'll say, this is the 80s in a way that Friends and Seinfeld rarely would say it's the 90s. I mean, I'm sure it happened once or twice. That it was they felt like it was the future. And in fact, if you think about it that way, Back to the future is the 80s, right? You're going back to the future. You're going back to the 1980s. Again, the very weird Oedipal thing about Back to the Future notwithstanding, the invention of rock and roll notwithstanding, the future was the 80s. We met the future and it is us kind of thing in a lot of ways. And so I think that helps explain a lot of the idea of live it like it's your last day. This idea of you get the money, spend the money now, go 1980s, bright lights, big cities, that kind of thing. Because I think that the 80s felt like we had reached the apogee of the modern world. There was no conception of the 1990s. I mean, hell, we'd reached 1984, right? This was 1984 was the ultimate futurism, and we reached it. When Apple does that commercial on 1984, it's in 1984. Prior to that, 1984 was the future. And so in some ways, I think they felt like they'd reached it.
Is it in some ways like a reaction though to the 70s, where you had that kind of loss of faith perhaps in American or perhaps maybe Western institutions more generally because of the Vietnam War, because perhaps you get the rampant inflation, you get kind of oil shocks, that's the system not necessarily working. Is it therefore that the 70s a bit, like rather than the Beatles and the 60s, you get Wings, right? It's like 70s, you get ABBA, but it's like, well, okay, but the 80s is a bit of a reaction in some ways to almost like the disappointment.
Right, which is ironic, right? Because I think you can almost capture the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s with that vertiginous guitar riff from Nirvana, right? Like, so sort of this Smells Like Teen Spirit is looking back and rejecting, just like, if you see the 80s kind of rejecting disco in a lot of ways, or probably more accurately incorporating it. That grunge is a direct response to the 1980s, to bands like Winger and Warrant and the spandex and the hair metal and all that kind of thing. It's a direct response to that, a rejection of the 1980s in a way that punk was a rejection of some of those things. I mean, I think the 80s were, despite Fukuyama's argument, I mean, I think the 80s, a lot of people thought they'd reached the end of history. That Fukuyama was trying to capture, I mean, obviously just 100% wrong, but trying to capture some sense of really what had gone on in the generation before it. And I think that's part of it, which is part of what that backlash is, of course, is going to be a backlash in the UK and in the US against Thatcherism, against Reaganism, in ways that one thing I always point out to my students is that, look, the reality is that if Ronald Reagan could have run for a third term, he would have won. There is no question about that. Dukakis fumbled maybe a winnable election, but the basic argument of Reaganism was, I think, wrong but popular. Short-term gain, long-term, and ironic. Like, how did the 80s look to the future? As something to mortgage.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I think with Reagan, of course, I think it was about the rhetoric. It's the feel-good factor, the optimism, and I think for Reagan and Thatcher, I think that the forces, you could say, that they were unleashed in terms of domestic politics and economic policy, I don't think they really got what they unleashed. I don't think they expected I think I think both are based all about those self-reliance and,
Well,
look after yourselves, your family, lower taxes, but the deregulation it unleashes and the culture it unleashes maybe is something which goes almost in some ways opposite of what they remember. So in terms of they want to like bring back like the 50s or the 60s or the like good small town America or good British shop workers kind of thing.
well, that's Reagan's entire rhetoric. Bob Batchelor raises a great question in the comment in the Q&A, which is bringing the 80s to light sheds light in the forgotten Gen X. And I mean, how many times do you see on your chosen social network? For me, it's Twitter, boomers like this, millennials like this. I mean, I saw one yesterday that was like directly counterpointing boomers, millennials, and Gen Z. And I'm like, hello, I mean, we are, in the most literal sense, this idea of a forgotten generation, that Gen X are like almost placeholders, even though one of the things I always say, and this is maybe getting a little off topic, but to defend Generation X a little bit, is we're the only ones who fully have gone through and utilized all the transition. There aren't a lot of jokes about Gen X not being able to use technology. I've been using cell phones. I've been using the internet. I've been using computers. I've been using smartphones longer than all these people. Like when we talk about students now being digital natives, they're really not. The things my kid knows about technology are incredible and expansive and shockingly narrow. And I see that every year when, we get a new batch of students and they have to use Canvas. They can't use email. They can't use a Word document. Like there's a certain narrowness that we as Gen X, I mean, I'm born in 1971. I am probably Mr. Gen X target demographic. Nevermind was aimed at me. Reality Bites was aimed at me. Singles was aimed at me, right? Latchkey Kid. I mean, all the cliches of Gen X that Bob, is alluding to are absolutely true. And I think that's because we are children of the 1980s. I mean, obviously born in the 70s, but for most people, I think you're a child of not your actual childhood, but when you came of age, that period when we went from childhood to something resembling adulthood. And I do, because suddenly if we can talk about the 80s and we can incorporate these memories and these things, then maybe Gen X will kind of get its due, because I feel like we really are this lost generation, and the forgotten Gen X that Bob says is I think 100% right.
Yeah, I agree. Also, in some, I think as well, when you're talking about something like the shared experience, it's about like the 3 channels, and everyone will watch the news. There's like half our local news, half our national news. It's almost like as the world has changed, I feel like it's almost like a 2 grumpy old men podcast kind of thing. But it's like, is it as the world has changed and got closer together, the world's actually got further apart? So actually, in the 80s, that you talked about the 80s being the last time of like perhaps the type of primary sources which are we're used to handling, but it's also the 80s, the last time maybe like a national experience or a broader experience where everybody watched, like Cheers, everybody watched the beginning of Seinfeld. But now there's so much out there that and everyone's kind of like, therefore, and we used to have like this national news. Everyone would watch these 3 channels. Now you've got the editorial news kind of things. So it's almost like as the world's got close together, the echo chambers have increased. So we're all kind of like become more disparate in some ways. As the 90s unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's that shared common experience it really is lost. I mean, everyone, like the Seinfeld or the Friends conclusion, or you're never going to match MASH for market share, because there's space and it's better, right, for so many interests. I mean, MASH this is where I'll get into my sort of pop culture journalist, critic, argumentative guy side, is that MASH was a very good TV show. MASH might have been a top 5 TV show of its era. it is not, you're never going to match the finale of MASH as a cultural moment. But I mean, it was not the best shows because there were 3 episodes on. It was a huge show. It was broad enough comedy to appeal to the conservative old man and the kid who had nothing else to watch, who was able to watch it. We'll never have that now because, I mean, here's a Gen X illusion. The Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing on. And that was a statement because we have 57 channels of television. Whereas, even the most mediocre cable package in the United States or whatever your is, it has literally hundreds. I mean, yeah, some of them are dead, but I mean, my TV literally had 999 possibilities out there with a legit probably 300 to 400 active ones and another 200-300 active ones if you want to pay something for them. So I mean, Bruce Springsteen is recognizing that fragmentation in his own way. And I wonder if we've lost something with sort of cultural connections, cultural commonality. But I don't know. Criticize Beyonce online, and you'll find that at least for some people, there's a common culture.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying to like common cultures that you can say to people of like, a Gen Xer about, you can make a pop culture reference. You can make a pop culture to Back to the Future. You can make a pop culture something in Friends or Seinfeld. And it's like the chances are they saw it.
Right.
But I just think about like my kids' days where we've got like Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Netflix, there's so much on. But all they want to do ultimately is like, must watch YouTube. And it's like, but are they watching the same stuff which their kids would watch? So I remember watching in children's BBC in this country in the broom cupboard. So I can make a joke about a broom cupboard to children's television to a colleague of a similar age or something. But my kids be able to make similar kind of pop culture references.
Everything will be an inside joke.
Yeah.
Now there might be a bigger inside than we realize there is, but yeah, I can't think of anything that, even a widespread cultural illusion is going to be relatively narrow, right? I mean, make a Ted Lasso reference. Lots of people are going to get it. More people aren't. Whereas, it's things that sink in to the sort of cultural, I don't know, the larger cultural big picture from our era really do kind of sink fairly broadly. And yeah, okay, older people might not have gotten it, young people might not be there yet, but there was a bulk, right? I mean, for anybody in Gen X, when we talk about drag shows, you can say, funny, I don't remember anybody complaining about Klinger. And everyone's going to be like, aha, Tootsie, aha, Mrs. Doubtfire, aha. We've lost that sort of common sense. I think that fragmentation in some ways explains why we're in different worlds, why Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could reach across the aisle in a way that Joe Biden and name your figure don't do because of this fragmentation. I don't know what others think.
So in terms of like the 80s, and there is, of course, the argument in terms of the 80s that like perhaps the biggest accomplishment you could say for Margaret Thatcher was Tony Blair, how the Labour Party changed in response to Thatcherism. I think she considered her biggest achievement was Tony Blair. You also have perhaps with Reagan, you obviously get the Republicans in Congress, Contract with America, Newt Gingrich. We also, of course, have Bill Clinton, the New Democrats. So is there an argument that in the 80s, the right of politics wins the economic argument? They win the actual big economic arguments of the time. And if so, how long did that last for? Or did they not really win the argument?
Yeah, I'm not sure they won the argument per se. I think that in some areas, I suspect that they did. I think what they did was create a cultural conversation that has put the left on the back foot more often than not. But then again, if you watch All in the Family, which is one of my favorite television shows of all time, the interesting thing is I had a grad student, when I showed a bunch of episodes, I did a seminar on the 70s, a grad seminar for master's students on the 70s. And I had a student ask a great question about All in the Family, which is, what are they laughing at? In other words, I'm not convinced that a lot of the people laughing at Archie Bunker weren't actually laughing with Archie Bunker. An uncomfortable subtext of All in the Family would be that they were laughing because Archie said something racist and they found the racist thing funny and not absurd. Like if I laugh at something, it's because that is an absurdity and he's supposed to be an absurdity. But Carroll O'Connor played the role so well that he spoke to certain kinds of Americans. I hate to say it, but you don't become the #1 show in America by speaking only to one fraction of the population. So, I mean, I think that had always been out there. But again, there are so many places to go out and get those voices. So I don't know winning would be weird. Saying winning would be weird because we have subsequently had the candidate relatively more to the left. How left Democrats are is a question. But after Bush wins his election, you have 92, 96. You have the 2000 election where the Democratic candidate won more votes. You have 2004 where Bush, even with questions in Ohio and elsewhere, Bush won that election. You have Obama. You have Trump winning the election, but not winning the popular vote in terms of what is appealing to people. And then you have Biden, who, clearly won by a massive number of votes. So if I put on my political consultant's hat, I think that Democrats and liberals and leftists have maybe more of a messaging problem than anything else. And that Reagan taught a different way to fight. But in a lot of ways, his inheritors lost the charm, his ability to work across and at least a sense of the liberal consensus. If we're going till noon my time, I think it's like 6 your time. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to toss in.
Anything else in the chat? Bob's still enjoying this. He's definitely more comments on Gen X. So I think that maybe there's the beginning there, Derek, like a special collection speaking to Gen X.
Yeah.
Anyone else with us wants to chip in or raise their hand or talk and chat on the audio? This is your time. No, it doesn't. I think people just kind of perhaps enjoyed your thoughts, Derek. I think.
Well, that's how we'll sell it. We won't sell it that no one read the book. We'll just sell it that everybody liked it and had nothing flabbergasting to say about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so suppose as you say, it's like coming to noon your time. So, but yeah, Derek, obviously, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for the paper and the conversation. Thank you, obviously, for being a big help as well in getting our network off the ground and being an important voice in that. So, yes, but I'll let you press on with your day, and have a happy afternoon. Good afternoon.
I'm flying to North Carolina to do a conference in South Carolina, so I have to start getting ready to leave.
Yeah, happy packing. So,
thank you.
Okay, nice to see you, Derek. Take care of yourself. I'll end the webinar now, and that'll mean we all leave. So
take care. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye.